Kallick, and I am a member of City Club's Forum Committee. For more than a century, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people work together to make Portland a better place for everyone and explore. We're gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel and are joined by thousands of Oregonians via X-Ray.FM's radio stations, KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app, and Open Signal's community media television stations. In addition to the City Club's valued media partners, our volunteers and staff enable us to put on the state's best civic programs every week. Please join me in showing our appreciation to everyone who has made this event possible. Climate change, criminal justice reform, the opioid crisis, taxes, PERS, foster care, gun control, public education, net neutrality, mass transit, the price of prescription drugs. These are just some of the issues that the Oregon legislature took up during the 28-day session that ended on March 3rd. Today, we're lucky to have two of the power players of the legislature here to talk about what happened and what didn't during the short session and what Oregonians should be looking forward to in 2019. Senator Jackie Winters is the minority leader of the Oregon State Senate. She has represented the 10th Senate District in and around the city of Salem since 2002. Prior to her election to the Senate, Senator Winters was a member of the Oregon House, the first African-American Republican to be elected to that body. Next year, Senator Winters will celebrate her 60th year serving the people of Oregon, having started her career in government service in 1959 in the Medical Records Unit at the University of Oregon Medical School. Representative Jennifer Williamson is the majority leader of the Oregon House of Representatives. She was first elected to represent the 36th District, including Northwest and Southwest Portland, in 2012. During her time at the state capitol, Representative Williamson has focused extensively on criminal justice reform, women's health care, and public education. She's a graduate of the University of Oregon and earned her law degree from Willamette University. Moderating today's discussion is one of the best in the business, Paris Aiken, the politics and state government reporter for the Portland Tribune and 34 other newspapers owned by the Pamplin and EO media groups. Her work has won more than a dozen journalism awards from the Society for Professional Journalists, the Oregon Newspaper Publishers Association, and the Vermont Press Association. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you, Andrew. The 2018 session was marked by some successful bipartisan legislation, including a gun bill. It was the first gun control bill since the Parkland, Florida shooting at a school. A lot of the more controversial legislation was sidelined, however, and that included some climate change legislation and some other pieces of legislation. So I'm looking forward to talking to both of you to recap some of those issues. I wanted to say to our broadcast audience that this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Paris Aiken, politics and state government reporter for the Portland Tribune. With me today are Jennifer Williamson, the majority leader of the Oregon House of Representatives, and Jackie Winters, the minority leader of the Oregon State Senate. So I wanted to start with climate change. When we were going into the legislative session, one of the main priorities for Democrats was to pass what's called a cap and trade bill, and that's basically putting a price on carbon, charging industry for the amount of carbon that they emit into the air. That was something that didn't pass this session, and part of that had to do with a lack of support. Senator Winters, can you tell us more about why that legislation didn't get through?
Well, you actually mentioned the lack of support, and the lack of support was not just in the Republican side of the aisle, but also the Democratic side of the aisle. There's the other piece of it is that, as you know, the session was a short session. And I think we can't forget when we have a short session where you have an issue like this, that it's extremely complicated. And we do try as much as we can to actually work together to actually figure out what really we should and should not do. and this was one of them. And so when you really step back, a short session really does not lend itself to all the comprehensive pieces that need to go into something like cap and invest or cap and jobs.
Was the impediment only the length of time during the session? Were there any particular flaws in the bill that you had issue with?
Well, there wasn't any specifics. I think coming into the session, if you recall, when we say lack of support, it was not just support in the building, it was support, the lack of support outside the building. Because one of the things as you actually, the legislature, both the Senate and the House, the stakeholders also have a lot to say and do about what ultimately comes out, as well as the legislators. So it was that support that was not there.
Jennifer Williamson, what was your vision for that bill? I know it was a priority for you. What were you hoping would happen, and what do you hope will happen in the future?
Sure, thank you, Paris. That bill was a priority for me, and it still is. I think that we can all recognize that climate change and the impact of climate change has a dramatic effect on the state of Oregon from every corner, whether it's our fire season year over year blowing out its budget, whether or not it's our farmers dealing with drought and water issues. It's something that we have to address as a state and do our part. I was excited about this bill. This is a policy that has been in the works for almost a decade. And so there have been a lot of folks who have worked on a cap and invest system that would work for Oregon. And we've looked to California and to Canada and to their carbon markets to learn how to do it best and to do it with other states. So I would have liked to have seen it done in February, frankly. And it didn't happen, but I think the good news and that the thing that people might not recognize is that we made a lot of progress on this issue in February. We were able to fund the studies that we need to fund in order to move that policy forward, and we created an Office of Carbon to continue developing the policy. We had stakeholder groups, bipartisan, bicameral, working on this policy up into the short session. The Senate President and the Speaker have committed to creating a committee. They just announced it, bipartisan, bicameral, to continue to develop the pieces of policy that some folks thought were not fully baked. I think that we have plenty of time to get that policy right, and we are still aiming for a 2021 implementation date. And even though the bill didn't pass this session, we're still on target to hit that.
And Paris, even though that bill did not go forward and didn't pass this session, there was one that did, and that was the Clean Air Oregon that actually, when we start talking about some of the environmental issues, that did pass. You know, that was a bill that actually Senator Fred Gerard and DEQ actually worked and other stakeholders worked to do, and that one did come out bipartisan and pass the Senate and the House. And so some things did occur, but as Representative Williamson says, that one didn't get baked, and yet, you know, there were some elements that did go forward, including, as you know, Oregon is a system that works best with committees, and so those committees that are now where stakeholders and others will be working in order to refine the bill that did not go through.
Since you brought up Cleaner Air Oregon, that bill was rolled back quite a bit, and some might argue that it's more academic than effective in reducing pollution in the air. Could you speak to that? What happened with that bill, and how effective do you think it was at the end results?
Well, I think it's like some things that we do, including some might not think it went far enough or that it is academic. Sometimes we've got to get the academic piece out of the way before we can actually get the programmatic piece in place. So I do think it was a starting point for us. And when we first started, and when the session first started, I think we wouldn't have given it that far going through the session. And it was towards the end of the session, it was very successful in getting it done.
House Majority Leader, would you like to comment on that?
Sure, thank you, Paris. I would have liked to have seen it gone a lot farther than what we ultimately passed, but we did get something passed. I think this was a good example, as we were reminded many times in the House, that often things we pass in the House don't make it through the Senate. So we were reminded time and time again of that this session. And so I would have liked to have seen a stronger program and more resources aimed at DEQ to make sure that the programs that we have there are being well funded so that DEQ can do its job in monitoring our air and water. So I hope we get another chance at strengthening that law and continuing to resource DEQ at a point where we know what's in our air and our water.
Both of you have worked extensively on criminal justice reform, which was the first thing I thought of asking about when I heard I would be interviewing both of you. There was some legislation that was passed that's now in the courts about sentencing reform that would reduce the mandatory sentences for theft and identity theft. State is appealing a disfavorable ruling on that. What is your plan if the state does not prevail and you end up, and maybe you could tell us some background on what the purpose of that bill was?
Sure. So I am lucky as a newcomer comparatively up on this panel to the legislature to be able to work with Senator Winters. As we heard in the opening, she has worked for the people of Oregon for nearly 60 years. And I consider Jackie Winters one of my mentors, especially in the area of human services and public safety. She is the expert in the building. And when I came in as a new legislator, I was able to work with her on a package of bills the package was called Justice Reinvestment. And the simple idea was that we can't continue to build prisons. It is an expensive way to not solve a problem of community safety. And so how could we encourage local governments to put more money into housing, treatment, stabilizing families, and the like in order to keep people out of prison? And we worked with the counties to say, if we give you money, how will you invest it to keep your community safer and to reduce your use of prison beds? So that was really the beginning of my work with this. Senator Winters can talk about her long history in working in criminal justice reform. But in 2017, we followed up the Justice Reinvestment Program with a safety and savings bill that, as you said, readjusted sentencing around theft in order to both save prison beds, but also to put money into programs that we know work around reentry and reduce recidivism. Some of our district attorneys, the District Attorneys Association opposed this bill and opposed it from the beginning. And they've opposed almost all of our criminal justice reforms in this state, quite frankly. So one of those district attorneys, John Foote from Clackamas County, decided on his own to sue the legislature on that bill and on the sentence reductions. We have asked for an expedited hearing in the Supreme Court so that we can settle this issue, because it will impact both our prison use and our budget if these what I think are well thought out, very specific sentence reductions are thrown out by the court. I'm confident. Our lawyers have told us, outside lawyers have told us, everything we did was perfectly legal and that this is a meritless case. But we'll wait and get the ruling from the Supreme Court, and we'll address the issues if there are any identified by the court.
Okay.
I'd
Would
like
you
just
like
to
to
remind, just in case the members of the City Club do not know, in Oregon now, when I started, and we'd always refer to the state prison in Salem. And now we have 14 cities. So we have built in the public safety system 14 prisons around the state. And when you begin to compare the cost of the prison system compared to what we're doing in education, it begs the question of where we're putting the investment. So in 2013, we actually began some work on reform. There were 4 co-chairs, myself, along with Garrett, who's now on the court, and Andy Olson out of Albany, as well as Floyd Pugansky, looking at how can we actually keep the community safe and at the same time to reduce the costs that we're doing in prison. Is there a better way of what we're doing? And so Representative Williamson framed it well as to how we got to 2017. In addition, in 2017, in looking at the projection in the women's prison particularly, where those numbers were going up, and identifying two things. One, why, and two, when we talk about the women's prison, we're also talking about that nexus in relationship to foster care and children. So it was with that we began looking and passed some legislation that would help to reduce actually the women. And as a result of that reduction, two things. One, we would avoid actually opening up the old women's prison, which would have cost us some $20 million just for the remodeling, and another $20 million just for operation. So those are kind of the context behind what we were doing in order the reform package.
Okay, before we leave this topic, I wanted to ask you about a trip that you two took together to Norway. Tell me what you learned on that trip. Why did you go, and what did you learn? And of course, who paid for it?
Thank you, Paris. So Senator Winters and I were invited to go to Norway to visit their prisons. And for those of you who don't follow the Norwegian prison system, they had a very violent prison system up until the mid-90s, and they had a handful of violent deaths, actually, in their murders in their prison, and they decided this is not the right way to do this. And so they put time, effort, energy, and policymakers all on the task of how do we turn this around? And they came out with a philosophy around their criminal justice system where the question that is always asked is, will this make this person a better neighbor? Recognizing that just like Oregon, well over 90% of people who are in our criminal justice system will come out and will be our neighbors. And so the government of Norway brought a delegation of folks from Oregon, Department of Corrections, Community Corrections, and the like. And we weren't the first state to do this. In fact, North Dakota is well ahead of us in this work. They were the first state to go there. And again, for those of you who don't spend a lot of time in criminal justice reform, the states that are leading this work are actually conservative states and states that are led by Republicans, mostly because the budgets of departments of corrections all over this country were exploding. And so it was a fascinating trip, and I'll let Senator Winters talk more about the details, but that concept of recognizing that people are coming out and they're re-entering and they're going to live with their families and they're going to live in community, and how do we make sure that when they do that, they're ready for that, the people around them are ready for that, and they're ready to re-engage as a productive member of society.
Senator Winters, what is prison like in Norway?
Well, actually, it was they didn't keep us and lock us in, just so you know. But the interesting thing is that for me, and when the delegation that went, I think we all were, number one, looking at the philosophy of saying, what kind of neighbor do you want? And that question then comes to, do you want us to send back what you sent to us? And I think we would all say, no, that is not what we want. And so their system is built around providing those tools with the expectation that the individual returning back into the community will be able to become responsible and become a good neighbor. And not only becoming the good neighbor, but there's a lot of emphasis on, for example, all of their individuals going into their system actually are either working or in school. Even so far as higher ed is a part of that system. Higher ed, they can come out with a PhD. They also come out with the skills for employment. They have the opportunity to spend a year working with their various disciplines before they're actually released. They actually have been engaged in working back with their families. So it's as much real life as you can possibly have exists in the Norway system. We found it interesting that rather than to talk about security as we know it, their security is a combination of security and social work. They said to us, how are you going to prepare an individual if you're not able to communicate and be a part of that individual? So their success rate, when you begin to step back and look at it, as well as the investment, is a lot different than what we do. But it does beg the question. I think we were very excited to say, what kind of neighbor do you want? What do you want us to send back into our community? Do you want to be able to keep your community safe? Do you want to be able to say that that individual that was a violent individual comes back to be a contributory individual? And so we're quite excited about it. In fact, we've invited them to come here to be a part. We were asking them to come to be a part of us in 2019 in a summit. So we've also have now, and I believe have an exchange program between our Department of Corrections and their staff in Norway. Interesting enough, Norway paid for our trip. We were very excited and glad that they did. No Oregon dollars, all Norway.
I foresee a potential reality show with the DOC staff exchange. The criminal justice system raises a multitude of issues and what drives the population in the prison system, and one of those is drug use, and also foster placements. Recently, the governor signed legislation related to the addiction crisis, including opioids, and also signed an executive order to have a commission that already exists on addiction to come up with a strategic plan for the state. Given how complex drug addiction is and all of the services, wraparound services required for it and the different kinds of drugs, what do you hope to accomplish from the commission's work? What do you hope to see come out of that?
I think, like any commission, is to come out with some recommendations so that you can, two things: reduce the number of the amount of usage, but also with the opioid addiction. As you know, there's a lot of deaths associated with it. There's also, you cannot divorce the opioid addiction locally with what's going on nationally. I just heard just recently the amount of dollars that we hopefully will receive from the federal government to help us in the work. But in addition to the opioid addiction, the whole issue of drug addiction comes into play. And when you look at the prison in the reforms that we're doing in public safety, it begs the question, prison is not, or the jails are not the place for a person who needs to be treated. And so, some of the work that we're all doing is drug courts and other ways of getting people into treatment so that they too can become a functional, responsible member in our society. The opioid crisis, as it's being referred to across this country, is one that I think that the commission hopefully will come back with some recommendation of how to reduce the amount, not only of the usage, but what we can do to be proactive.
There was also, I think, a piece in the New York Times about meth addiction, and that actually more people die from meth than opioids. What is the state doing, if anything, to address that? Jennifer Williamson?
Thank you, Paris. I was actually going to mention that. I mean, the opioid addiction has been in the news and has been a focus of a lot of our work. In fact, since coming into the legislature, I have sponsored a bill every year to help address the opioid addiction issue in our state. And since 2012, death by opioids have gone down 25% in Oregon. So we're not doing enough yet. We cannot fix a healthcare crisis, a public health crisis in a criminal justice system or another system. I think that the commission shows that we are committed as a state to treating this as a healthcare crisis, as a public health crisis in our state. And I think that's the biggest impact that the commission and the focus on addiction and recovery will come out of this session. But as you said, methamphetamine is on the rise in Oregon, and more people die in Oregon from using methamphetamine than opiates. And so we can't pull one drug out of the addiction crisis and try to address just that. It's a much larger issue that is very complex. As you said, it's a housing issue. It's a criminal justice issue. If we look at what's driving the female population, inmate population, as the senator mentioned earlier, drug addiction it's something like 80 to 90% of the women who come into our system are addicted to drugs or alcohol when they come in. And over 75% of those women are moms. So if you want to talk about intergenerational issues, you don't have to look any farther than the addiction crisis to see that. And so it's not something that we're going to be able to pull out, put into a commission and say, oh, here are some recommendations about what we can do. Let's get some more treatment beds. That's the first step. This is a community-wide public health crisis that we're going to have to focus on from every aspect of our policymaking.
Before we move on, I want to remind the radio audience that this is the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Paris Aiken, politics and state government reporter for the Portland Tribune. With me today, Jennifer Williamson, the majority leader of the Oregon House of Representatives, and Jackie Winters, the minority leader of the Oregon Senate. Let's move on, since I mentioned, before I go on actually to the foster care, I wanted to ask you about the 2019 budget outlook, PERS, and taxes. So starting with taxes, there was a Senate bill that the governor signed that basically eliminated a tax exemption that for pass-through businesses. It was a part of the federal tax reform. Oregon mimics the federal tax code, but in this case, Oregon decided to remove that exemption. And tell us a little more about why you wanted to do that, Jennifer Williamson.
Thank you, Paris. So when the Trump administration and Paul Ryan passed their tax bill, it was a hugely complicated bill just as we were going into session, and I think we're still trying to figure out the impact of that bill. And generally, Oregon is tied, our tax code is tied to the federal tax code. But in this case, Oregon already has a pass-through entity business tax break. We passed that in 2013. And so if we were to have also implemented the federal pass-through tax breaks, it would have been a doubling down on a tax break that we already had. And so when we disconnected from the federal tax code, we were holding on to the tax policy we had. And so I was happy that the governor signed that bill and passed that bill. I do think that Oregon and our policymakers and our revenue tax writers should be in charge of how we write our tax policy in Oregon. And that was a good example of something happening in DC that would have blown a hole in our budget and one that we had not anticipated. And so I was happy that the governor passed that bill.
She was happy and I was not.
We agree on most things, Senator Winters and I, but sometimes we disagree.
She was happy because, and I was not, because it was a $244 million taking from small business. So, I'm a small business owner and a small business, and so we believed that $244 million should go back to the small businesses who paid it. So we did disagree on this particular bill. There was a lot of comments coming from the business community and others to the governor some while before she decided to actually sign the bills. At one point, she said she was going to veto the bill, and it is because you're talking about the $244 million. So this is where the two of us, we do get along, but sometimes we don't. And on this particular one, we disagreed on that Senate bill.
One of the senators in your caucus, Senator Boquist, has threatened to sue.
Yes, and that's because the bill actually was a Senate bill, and tax bills should originate in the House, not the Senate. And it also, it's a tax. And if it's a tax, it requires a 3/5 vote. That was, so that is the basis of Senator Boquist's suit over the bill itself, and to let the courts actually to weigh in to decide.
So you think that would,
It
do you think
was
that
a,
would
it
give
is, because it is a tax. And it also should have required more than a simple majority vote.
You had some legislation that you tried to pass that would have addressed the
I think it's, you know,
Supermajority.
yes, because for clarity, we believe that that issue needs to be resolved. Whether or not that 16 vote is where it deals with taxation, or it deals with fees of those taxes, or is, I mean, we all can come up with our definition. But a tax is, we think a tax is a tax. And if it is a tax, and the Constitution requires that tax originates out of the House, not out of the Senate.
So just to keep the listeners with us, when we talk about a tax, the legislation that you proposed and the suit that Senator Boquist may file involves fees and exemptions in addition to actual levying of taxes. So basically, they're saying that eliminating an exemption is passing a tax. Is that correct? Okay. Would you like to respond?
Sure, I disagree with the good Republican Senate leader. This is not a tax increase. This was us disconnecting from the federal tax code and not having a new corporate tax break take effect that would have, that $240,000 would have come out of our budget that we already budgeted towards the essential needs of the state. And so the fact that policy was passed at the federal level and we decided to not connect that part of our tax code to the federal code, in my mind and in the mind of our lawyers, was not a tax increase.
So that is why we need, you know, to have the court weigh in, since neither the two of us can agree on whether or not it was a tax or not a tax. We think it was a tax. We also think that it would have required a 3/5 vote rather than a simple majority vote. And so that's the, and we do disagree periodically.
So you disagreed, I believe, on another bill. I'm just guessing here, but there was a PERS bill that you proposed during session, and I believe it involved requiring public employees to make some contribution toward their pension. Is that right? Can you tell us more about that bill?
I don't,
No?
I'm not familiar with that, because we did pass the governor's PERS bill, bipartisan, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, PERS has been in the news lately. There was a New York Times.
It's always in the news. I think there was this, it's always in the news because of the unfunded liability that's there, and it's also in the news because it came, the news, and I believe it was where you have the top 10 was published, which some of us think that we eventually are going to have to address the issue of some of the huge amount of payouts.
What would you like to see happen with PERS next session?
Well, so Paris, this is the way I think about PERS. We've got a couple of issues when we talk about PERS, and the way I initially got my head around it is you think about it like a credit card. So you think about what you're spending right now on your credit card versus your credit card bill. And so we have been reforming the PERS system, basically what we put on our credit card, how we charge on our credit card, in both 2003 and 2013. And we made those reforms to reduce the cost of the system and to reduce the kinds of benefits that current employees receive from the PERS system. Those changes, we tried to make some to our credit card bill as well. We tried to negotiate a different payment system with our credit card bill in those two reforms, and the Supreme Court said no. A deal's a deal. We made a deal with public employees that their paycheck was going to be this much and that their retirement benefits were going to be this much, and that's when they took the job. And so looking at that unfunded liability, what we've got now is how do we pay that bill when the court has told us that we have to pay? It's an obligation. And you know, the New York Times mentioned a couple of outliers in the PERS system, talked about Coach Bellotti from U of O and President Joe Robertson from OHSU. The way that they had inflated PERS benefits, we've taken care of in the system. We've passed reforms that don't allow that to happen anymore. But the average PERS retiree in Oregon makes $27,000 a year. And so it would be, going back and trying to recoup benefits from the folks who are already retired would be like us going back and saying, we think we overpaid you, and so now we need you to pay us back out of your salary. So the real issue is, how do we pay that credit card bill? How do we meet the obligation the court has told us that we have to meet? And so it ends up just like every other obligation we have as a state. It goes into the budget, and we have to figure out the revenue to pay that. And I think that's where, when we talk, if we got rid of the entire PERS system for every employee right now, it would do nothing for our unfunded liability that is the issue that continues to come up. And so, we don't have to pay that credit card bill at all at once. In fact, our PERS system is in the top 5 of the best, the most well-funded and run system in the country. And so I think we're doing a good job with the system. Now it's a question of how do we pay that bill.
The unfunded liability and even the credit card at some point has to be paid. But having said that, there a lot of work that has been done on PERS. Representative Williams is correct that the rank and file are not the issue of the PERS system. And a deal is a deal. I happen to have been there when the deal was made. Somebody said 60 years ago how long I've been around, and that was done when Governor Atiyeh was governor. And that was when we had the double-digit inflation and double-digit interest rate, and a lot of double digits that we were having to deal with the economy. And so that deal was made then, and that deal will be honored. But while we're honoring that deal, we still have to look at how we're going to continue to pay that bill, whether it is, and there's been several proposals of side accounts for education and what have you. And I think we will continue to look at how we control the cost that's associated with PERS without, and I put that on the, without having to take away from our public employees who have rely on it, quite frankly. And there are those individuals who are employees who nowhere near that the payout is what we read about the Bellottis and the Joe Robinsons and when you're allowing to add other sources to your income, because they don't have other sources in their income. So I just need to put that out there, but we will continue to grapple with PERS.
The foster care system has been plagued with high caseloads, appalling cases of placements, and a shortage of foster parents. What are some things that you did to address the foster program during the 2018 session?
As you know from budget, we did add more employees, more caseworkers to the foster care system. And I do know that they have a new director. Fairbourse is actually there. My latest report that I had received, I think recently, where they were having high numbers of foster children in hotels, that is going down now. They're actively engaged in trying to recruit and bring in and train more foster parents, but also at the same time, your caseworkers also are having to be trained, the new one that's coming in the system. In addition, as I understand it, there was a huge turnover of workers in the child welfare system. That now is beginning to stabilize, and hopefully that will get better. I've had a couple of meetings with the stakeholders as well as the governor. It's an issue that I think that also that the community has to be engaged a lot more than they are currently. There's this notion that somehow any problem that exists in our community, that we send it off to somebody else. Whether it is to our criminal justice system or whether it's our foster care system. And yet, when you step back and you look at it, they are part and parcel of all of us. And so I think you're going to hear more coming out about community engagement and community involvement in order to not only recruit more foster homes and shelter facilities and what have you for children, but also what can the community do to be a lot more helpful. And I know the Casey Foundation has been working with the agency along those lines of talking about community involvement and community engagement. I like to say these are all of our children. They don't belong to the state. They belong to all of us. And it's the community. When the community is functioning well, you'll find that our children are functioning well as well. So I think you're going to hear a lot more about the agency reaching out into the community to get the community involved.
And what makes you say that? Is there a public outreach
because
campaign?
like I said, Casey's Foundation, that's one of their principles, a major principle. I think we've learned enough about you just can't magically say, I wave my wand and there's a foster home. You can't just magically say, I wave my wand and there's a shelter care. That doesn't happen, and unless the community itself actually adopts and says, yes, we will help, then you begin to get what you need. That's the same way with the other program, and I know it's one here in Portland, with relief nurses, one of the most successful across this state, that started in Eugene. And when there used to be 3, now there's over 30-some, and it's to work with the community in a bipartisan way to keep actually high-risk families and working with them so they're not going into foster care. So there is some work that's going on in communities that I think that communities can step up and help with.
Would you like to make a quick comment before I move on to audience questions?
Yes, thank you, Paris. I agree with the senator. It will take a multifaceted approach to fix our broken foster care system. And we put $15.7 million into additional resources into the system in the short session. And as the senator said, that was to support our caseworkers, to train foster families, to bring them into the system. But I think the bottom line is we have to keep our eyes on the ball. We have to make sure that we are always putting our foster children first and making sure that their safety and their security is what we're focused on, and put the dollars into the things that will impact those kids the most.
Okay, well, let's go to the audience. Everyone watching or listening today is welcome to ask a question. If you have a written question on an index card, hold it high for the City Club staff to collect. You can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum. To City Club members who would like to ask a question at the microphone, please identify yourself as a member and ask one question in 30 seconds or less.
Win Wakala, City Club member. I know recently legislation was passed that prohibited cigarettes for people under 21. My question is, knowing that people are not mature enough to decide to smoke until they're 21 or decide to drink until they're 21, how can they be mature enough to dance topless in a room full of people they don't know until they're 21?
Who would like to?
We need to change that law.
Sure. Thank you, Wynn, for your question and for all of your work that you do. I know for victims of sex trafficking, Wynn is one of the leaders in the state on those issues. And our trafficking issue is a huge issue in this state that I know the Attorney General is taking very seriously, along with our district attorneys. And it's a complicated issue, as I know you know well. And one of the things that we've been looking at in our world, the senator and I, is how do we help those victims of trafficking. And one of the bills we passed in 2017 was how do you, if a young woman shows up in a criminal court and was forced to do something criminal by someone who is trafficking her, that's actually a defense to a crime. And so, so we are looking at different ways at addressing that underground underground criminality and the issues that we know are hard to ferret out in the sex trafficking world. As to your question about the age limit, that is something that the court has worked on, and is my understanding, until we change something in the Constitution, that will continue to be the age at which 18 is the age at which somebody can dance topless, as you say. So I think it's incumbent upon us as policymakers to make sure that anyone working in an adult industry is safe, and that we ensure that trafficking is rooted out in this state.
But in addition, and I know Senator Hansel and others with legislation as a way that if the individual want to get out, that a way that they can get access or call in order to be able to get rescued. So that's another piece of this, of assisting individuals to facilitate a way for them without harm, that they can be able to get rescued.
Okay, another question?
Mike Litt, City Club member. This has to do with the Clean Energy Jobs Bill. Has anyone in any testimony or anyone else, any of the other legislators, pointed out to you that although it's true that in politics and government, compromise is the rule if we want progress, you can't compromise with physics. You can't compromise with chemistry or biology. And as time goes on, more carbon is entering the atmosphere, more forests are burning, more seafood is threatened, more floods, more climate refugees, more wars, et cetera, et cetera. Has anyone pointed out to you, and if they have, how would you respond?
Sounds like he's asking you, shouldn't there be some more urgency to climate change legislation?
I don't know about the good representative. I don't serve on those committees, and as you know, most of our work is done in committees. There has been a lot of discussion, however, about the topics that you have raised, including the whole issue of the carbon emission from forest fires and what have you. We hear a lot of that. But to all of your specifics, no, in the way that you have phrased it, we have not. I don't know about my colleague, but you know, you said compromise, may or may not. And I said earlier that Oregon is a committee system. And so through that committee system, most of our testimony and what we receive come through those particular committees. And in addition to that, you know, we debate and discuss and, you know, all that we can in order to come to the conclusion. But once whatever bill comes to the floor of either respective chambers, it's then is where you decide whether it's going to go forward or not going to go forward based on the 60 in the House and 30 in the Senate. So we do try, and as much as we can, to be learn the issues that are at hand. But we also depend upon a lot, and I see some individuals in the audience. We depend on various sources in which to make our respective decisions.
Representative Williamson, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you. So, you know, as I said earlier, this is an issue that's been percolating at the policy level in the state of Oregon for over a decade. And the urgency issue is something that, you know, I certainly feel, and is the reason it's one of my priorities, and that I wished it would have passed really 10 years ago when we first started working on it. But I received thousands of postcards, and hundreds of kids came to the Capitol to talk about why aren't we passing policy that protect them and protect their future. And there is an urgency to getting this done. And even if the physical destruction of climate change is not the thing that motivates you, The economy of Oregon cannot wait any longer for this. Whether it's our oceans or our forests, or the money that will come and be reinvested from the carbon market, especially into our rural communities, to looking at our farming practices and our fishing practices and how we make them better and more sustainable. And we have struggled in this state. Our timber economy was gutted decades ago, and our small rural towns have struggled. And I believe this is the way that we reinvigorate those towns and we keep rural Oregon a vibrant place to live and to raise your families. And that's the additional piece of urgency that I don't know that everybody gets.
And, you know, along that line, talking about our timber-dependent communities, and so we receive often from them about the ability to manage the forest. And to manage timber, and you probably, as you know, you have the private, then you have both the state and federal, and they're not all managed the same. I think we would all like to say that the state does a much better job than we get from our federal counterparts. Having said that, the carbon emission from the forest fires, and we wrestle and struggle with that particular issue. Would it be better if we're able to get the fuel off the ground of our forest? That would do two things. Actually, it would help with the emission, but it would also, we spend a tremendous amount from our budget in putting out forest fires through the years. So it's a complicated subject when it comes to the Capitol. And I'm mindful that having grown up in this wonderful, great state of ours, that natural resources, plays a tremendous part. And once we no longer able for those smaller communities who were dependent upon on the forest industry, and they're struggling without to become economically viable again. And there is, I said, if there's anything that we have to do as a state, this great state, we've got to do something with the divide. And that divide is the urban-rural divide. Because the thought process, or what one thinks about in one part of the state, may not be the same in another part of the state. And I think we've got to come together as a state to begin to actually resolve, similar to what we did during the days when I was with McCall.
Okay, let's move on to another audience question. Go ahead, sir.
Steve Novak, City Club member. First of all, thank you both for your great work in criminal justice reform. Senator Winters, the Trump tax cut that you supported wouldn't have applied.
How do you know that?
Hey, what? The bill you were talking about, the tax cut for
Senate Bill 1528.
for pass-throughs would not apply just to what we normally think of as small businesses. It would have given a tax break to partners in big law firms. And according to the Legislative Revenue Office, 60% of the money would have gone to people whose personal income is more than $210,000 a year. My question is, instead of just championing the Trump tax cut, couldn't you have come up with a more narrowly targeted tax cut specifically for noble, struggling small business people with kids in Little League who make less than $80,000 a year?
Well, they do have a special session coming up, right? So.
Yes, we do. The governor is talking about sole proprietor, so I suspect, Steve, that you're probably down to, maybe to come down if we have the special session, to pitch that for her.
Because I don't know why the devil should get a tax break, but that's another issue.
Because that's where, no, I'm not going to comment, Steve.
Would you like to respond to that?
Sure, I think, thank you, Steve, for your question. I disagree with the pass-through tax. I've disagreed with it for many years, and it was my hope, and my caucus voted to roll back the entire pass-through tax break from 2013. So we may be in a special session to address additional issues with that. We will wait to be called by the governor.
Okay.
Carol Witherell, and thank you, City Club member, thanks so much for being here and your work on justice system reforms and the Norway prison system. That's great. My question has to do, in honor of the students who walked out of school today at 10 and the 10th anniversary of the Columbine School, what further work are you doing on gun legislation, and what do you each believe is also needed now?
I can start. Thank you, and thank you for your question, and thank you for recognizing our students who have been tremendous in the last year in really standing up and speaking out about gun violence and the way that they experience it. I have, since first appearing in Salem, worked on gun violence prevention. In fact, one of the reasons I ran was to ensure a universal background check for gun purchases, including private sales, and we were able to pass that bill, and I'm thrilled that we passed that. But we have a dirty little secret in this state, which is if you don't get your background check back from the state police in 3 days, you can buy your gun anyway. And so we don't have universal background checks in the state of Oregon. If you have a complicated background and it takes the state police, a state police researcher, more than 3 days to figure out what it is that's flagging in your background on a gun sale, you can still buy it. And this is known as the Charleston loophole because the shooter in Charleston at the AME Baptist Church got his gun that way. He shouldn't have gotten it. His background check took too long, and so he was able to get it anyway. And we've been unable to pass that piece of our background check bill, even though we had folks like Reverend Sharon Risher, whose mother, 2 sisters, or her mother, her cousin, and 2 friends all died in that shooting in Charleston. They were all part of that Bible group, came out and talked about the impact on her community. So I am committed to getting that done. We do have to remember that in Oregon, the vast majority of gun violence and gun deaths come from suicide and domestic violence. And so we have to keep our eye on the ball on how we impact gun violence in those 2 areas. And we've made continued progress in domestic violence, but we are not done. There's always more to do. And one of the things we did last session that I think probably flew under the radar for most folks is, because we didn't talk about it, we passed a creation of a public health violence prevention center at OHSU in order specifically to study gun violence. And so we are starting that public health signature center. And part of it was in response to the lack of research that we have in public health on guns in the state of Oregon and across this country because of the federal ban on research and research dollars at the National Institutes for Health. Studying gun violence. So stay tuned. We will be getting more research from Oregon Health Sciences University to help us direct our resources in the best way possible to reduce gun violence and gun deaths in the state.
And for me, and the good representative mentioned the length of time that it takes the state police in order to do the background checks, which for me, it's like, okay, then we need to give you the resources that you need in order to get those background checks done, similar to what we had to do in spurring up to get the rape kits and some of those other things done when we found the backlog. I come from the place it doesn't do us any good to have legislation passed and we're not given the resources with which to make it happen. So, from my perspective, that needs to be a budgetary item. And I spoke with the governor about it when we talked about the Charleston loophole, that we need to make certain that the resources are there so that the state police can actually have the staff with which to get those background checks done. Can I add and the good rep knows that in domestic violence, and one of the things that I've said, we did not go far enough. And that I'm talking as to one of the bills that I want next session, and actually it's been years since we've actually looked at and have had a work group to delve in, not just the issue of talking about the guns, but domestic violence in and of itself, and how long it takes for us to not only get some of the legal documents that we need, but also the lack of the resources that are needed and necessary for the individuals, whether we're talking about the diversion into alcohol and drug treatment, whether we're talking about the impact on children and what have you. So one of my bills this session coming in, we'll be talking about putting together a comprehensive work group to deal with domestic violence. In addition, I'm working with the Attorney General's office to talk about this sexual assault piece, because that's another piece of when we start talking about doing our diving of what we're having in society. And that piece is working with the high schools Why do we have to wait until people are adults to talk about some of these issues?
I think we need to wrap up, but thank you everyone for the questions.
Our time is up for today, and we need to pause the discussion for now, but I do hope this is the beginning of even more in-depth conversations for each of you. Please join me in thanking our panel, as well as Andrew Kallick for producing today's program. And thank all of you for coming, and we hope to see you at another City Club event soon. We're adjourned.